My name is Harper Reynolds. I'm in my late 30s now, old enough to have watched patterns repeat, young enough to still feel surprised when they do. For most of my adult life, I've worked in a role that rewards patience, steady, behind the scenes, rarely applauded. I'm not the loud one in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for attention. People usually describe me as reliable, reasonable, and sometimes too quiet. What they don't usually say, because it's harder to notice, is that being quiet often makes you invisible. If you'd met me years ago, you might have assumed I was the least complicated person in my family, the one who didn't need much, the one who would be fine. I was the listener at the table, the mediator during disagreements, the one who showed up early and stayed late without asking why. I learned early that harmony was more valued than honesty, and I carried that lesson carefully, like a fragile heirloom. This story isn't about revenge, it isn't about winning, and it isn't about painting anyone here as a villain. It's about inheritance, not just money, but expectation. It's about how something meant to provide security quietly rewired loyalty, distorted memory, and turned shared history into something transactional. Over time, what began as small assumptions hardened into roles. Some of us were trusted, some doubted, some were indulged, and some, like me, were depended on without being considered. No one announced this shift. There was no single argument you could point to and say, that's when everything broke. It happened the way erosion happens, slow, unremarkable, and only obvious once the ground gives way. I want to be clear about something. I'm telling this story honestly, not dramatically. I'm not here to justify myself or to ask for sympathy. I'm here because when money enters a family system, especially at the moment of loss, it doesn't just reveal character. It rewards certain behaviors and punishes others, often without intention. And if you're the person who's always been quiet, always been fine, you might recognize how dangerous that can be. What you'll hear is a gradual emotional journey. How I was seen before anything went wrong. The first moment I realized respect wasn't evenly distributed. How silence became a habit, then a strategy. And how clarity, once it arrived, couldn't be undone. There are no shouting matches here, no dramatic ultimatums, just decisions made calmly and consequences that followed, whether anyone was ready for them or not. If you've ever been the dependable one, the person others lean on without checking if you're standing on solid ground, this story might feel uncomfortably familiar. So before we go any further, let me ask you gently, have you ever realized too late that being easy to rely on also made you easy to overlook? Before money ever entered the conversation, before documents and percentages and quiet resentments, I already had a role in my family. I didn't choose it. No one ever formally assigned it, but everyone seemed to agree on it without discussion. I was the reasonable one. At family gatherings, I was the person who arrived on time and helped in the kitchen without being asked. If something needed fixing, paperwork, schedules, a computer issue, it naturally drifted in my direction. When tensions rose, eyes turned to me, not because I had authority, but because I had patience. I was expected to smooth things over, to translate emotions into something manageable. People often confuse that with strength. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's just a habit. Compared to my siblings and cousins, I didn't stand out. I wasn't the most successful, But I wasn't struggling either. I didn't need help, which in family language often means you don't need consideration. I didn't demand attention, so none was given. When decisions were made, I was informed, rarely consulted. No one thought they were being unkind. That's the important part. This wasn't cruelty, it was comfort. I was predictable, stable, low maintenance. And families, like systems, optimize around what causes the least friction. When relatives described me to others, it was always the same handful of words. Harper's easygoing. Harper doesn't mind. You can count on Harper. What they never said was what that actually meant. Harper will adapt. I absorbed that identity quietly. I told myself it was maturity. I told myself it was emotional intelligence. I told myself that being the calm one was its own kind of respect. And for a long time, that belief protected me. It allowed me to stay connected without conflict. But it also trained everyone else not to check in. When family plans were made, my schedule was assumed to be flexible. When responsibilities were divided, mine were implied rather than discussed. If someone crossed a boundary, arrived late, forgot something important, changed plans at the last minute, the expectation was that I'd understand. And I did, over and over again. I wasn't invisible in the sense that no one saw me. I was invisible in the sense that my reactions were never factored into the equation. People reacted around me, not with me. There's a subtle difference between being valued and being relied upon. I didn't understand that distinction at the time. Looking back, I can see how early it formed. Even before adulthood, I was the one trusted to handle things sensibly. While others were allowed to be emotional, I was praised for being composed. While others were forgiven for mistakes, I was praised for not making them. Praise can be a quiet contract. It teaches you what you're allowed to be. So I learned to be small without shrinking, present without demanding space. When our parents aged and conversations about the future began, casual at first, almost theoretical, I was already positioned as the one who would help. Not lead, not decide, just help. The one who would make things easier for everyone else. And I accepted that framing without protest. Because it felt familiar. Because it felt like love. What I didn't realize then was that by being so consistently accommodating, I had removed myself from the category of people whose reactions mattered. I wasn't a variable. I was a constant. Constants don't get negotiated with. At that stage, there was no resentment in me, no bitterness, just a vague sense that if something ever went wrong, I would be expected to absorb it quietly. I didn't yet know what wrong would look like. I only knew on some level that if a line were ever crossed, no one would notice it had been drawn, not because they didn't care, but because I had taught them not to look. The first time something shifted, it didn't announce itself. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic pause in conversation. It was small enough that if I described it out of context, most people would tell me I was overthinking it. That's usually how the first cut happens. We were sitting around the dining table after a long family lunch. Plates had been cleared, coffee poured. The conversation drifted, as it often did, toward practical matters. Someone mentioned our parents' house, repairs it would eventually need. rising property taxes, and the general inconvenience of upkeep. It was casual, almost hypothetical. Then one of my siblings laughed and said, "Well, Harper will probably handle all that anyway. You're good at that stuff." It was said warmly, affectionately even, a compliment on the surface. Everyone nodded. Someone else added, "Yeah, Harper doesn't mind. You're always so organized." And that was it. The conversation moved on. No one looked at me to confirm. No one asked if I wanted that responsibility. The assumption slid into place so smoothly, it didn't even register as a decision. It became a fact the moment it was spoken. I remember smiling, not because I agreed, but because that was the expected response. Smiling kept things easy. Smiling kept me in my role. But something about that moment stayed with me. It wasn't the responsibility itself. I was capable of handling it. It wasn't even the unfairness, at least not yet. It was the realization that my consent wasn't part of the process. My willingness was presumed, not requested. That night, driving home, I replayed the moment in my head. I tried to dismiss it. I told myself they were just being practical. I told myself families make these kinds of assumptions all the time. I told myself it wasn't personal. Still, it lingered. After that, similar moments started to appear. Quiet, consistent, easy to overlook. Decisions about shared expenses would be discussed in broad strokes, then finalized elsewhere. I'd be informed later, usually with the phrase, "We figured you'd be okay with it." And I was. Or at least, I didn't object. Each time, it felt too minor to challenge, too small to disrupt the peace over. And I'd been trained, carefully and lovingly, to believe that harmony was worth protecting, even at my own expense. What made it harder was that no one else seemed to notice anything wrong. When I mentioned one of these moments to a friend, they shrugged and said, "It just sounds like they trust you." That explanation almost worked. Trust and convenience look very similar from the outside. The difference is who gets to choose. I didn't bring it up with my family. I didn't want to sound ungrateful. I didn't want to introduce tension where none was visible. And part of me still believed that being relied on was a kind of honor. So I stayed quiet, but silence has a way of sharpening your memory. Once you notice a pattern, you can't unsee it. Every assumption, every casual dismissal, every time my role was referenced without my presence, it all began to line up. The first small cut didn't hurt much. It barely bled, but it changed the way I listened. I started paying attention not just to what was said, but to who was being addressed. I noticed how often plans were made around me instead of with me. How often was my agreement implied after the fact? And I noticed something else too. The more consistently I accepted these assumptions, the more confidently they were made. No one was trying to hurt me. That was the most unsettling part. This wasn't malice. It was momentum. A system continuing to do what it had always done because no one had ever asked it to stop. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't pull away. I didn't change my behavior outwardly at all. I just remembered. And that, as it turns out, was the beginning of everything. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. No escalation. No apology either. Life continued in its familiar rhythm, which made it easy to tell myself that what I'd noticed didn't really matter. That's how normalization works. It doesn't demand your agreement, it just waits for your silence. The assumptions kept coming, subtle enough to pass as efficiency. Family emails would circulate with decisions already framed as settled. My name would appear next to tasks I hadn't volunteered for. Harper will coordinate. Harper can handle the paperwork, always stated as if it were already true. And most of the time, it became true because I let it. I told myself I was choosing the path of least resistance, that it wasn't worth the emotional cost of pushing back, that everyone had their strengths, and this just happened to be mine. I reminded myself that I didn't want control, so why did I care about being consulted? But the truth was quieter and less flattering. I was afraid that if I objected, I'd be seen as difficult, uncooperative, ungrateful. Once you've been cast as the easy one, asserting yourself feels like a betrayal of character. There was one moment that crystallized this for me. We were discussing a future family expense, something significant but not urgent. Numbers were thrown around casually, without detail. Someone suggested a split that was uneven, not outrageous, just tilted. I cleared my throat and asked gently, "Can we walk through how we're dividing that?" The room went still for half a second, just long enough to register surprise. Then someone laughed and said, "Wow, Harper, I didn't know you were worried about that stuff." The conversation moved on without answering my question. I didn't ask again. That was the moment I realized how deep the pattern ran. It wasn't just that my silence was expected. It was that my speaking up felt disruptive, out of character, slightly inconvenient. So I adapted. Again, I rationalized everything. I told myself that families aren't boardrooms, that fairness is subjective, that keeping relationships intact mattered more than perfect equity. I convinced myself that my discomfort was the price of peace, and in doing so, I taught everyone something important, that my boundaries were flexible, if they existed at all. Over time, I became adept at swallowing the small frustrations before they could harden into resentment. I would feel the initial flare, surprise, disappointment, sometimes a quiet anger, and then I'd talk myself out of it. They don't mean it. It's not worth it. This is just how families work. The problem with that logic is that it only flows in one direction. No one else was adjusting their behavior. No one else was questioning their assumptions. The system didn't correct itself because from the outside, it appeared to be functioning perfectly. I was handling things. Things were getting done. There were no conflicts to resolve. Why would anyone change? The more I normalized this dynamic, the less visible my inner resistance became. Outwardly, I was calm and capable as ever. Inwardly, I was becoming an observer in my own family, someone who watched patterns instead of participating in them. I started keeping mental notes, not out of spite, but out of clarity. Who decided what? Who benefited? Who absorbed the inconvenience? I noticed how often money conversations framed responsibility as competence, and how conveniently that competence always landed in my lap. And still, I said nothing. Part of me believed that this was temporary. That was when something truly important came up. The dynamic would correct itself. That surely, when the stakes were high enough, I'd be treated as an equal. That belief allowed me to endure the smaller indignities without confronting the larger truth. But normalization has a cost. Each time you accept something that doesn't sit right, it becomes easier for others to assume you always will. Each unchallenged moment becomes precedent, and precedents have a way of solidifying just in time to matter most. By the time I realized how thoroughly this pattern had set, it no longer felt like something that could be addressed with a single conversation. It felt structural, embedded. I hadn't just been quiet, I had been predictable. And predictability in systems involving money and power is rarely neutral. The moment I understood my role clearly wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with anger or heartbreak. It came with something colder and more precise: recognition. We were gathered for a planning meeting, nothing official, just family around a table with notebooks and phones. The topic was future arrangements, long term care, assets, things people talk about in careful language so they don't sound greedy. Everyone spoke freely. Opinions were offered, dismissed, and revised. There was debate, even mild frustration. Voices overlapped. Authority shifted back and forth. And I noticed something that hadn't stood out before, because I'd never stepped outside it. No one asked me what I thought. They asked me how things could be done, how paperwork should be filed, how timelines worked, how to make decisions easier. But never whether I agreed with the decisions themselves. I wasn't there as a stakeholder. I was there as infrastructure. That realization landed with surprising calm. Once you see the outline of a role, you can stop pretending it's accidental. I understood then that I had been categorized a long time ago. Not consciously, not maliciously, but efficiently. I was the reliable one, the useful one, the one who wouldn't complicate things with emotion or ego. That meant I was safe to depend on and safe to exclude. When I finally spoke during that meeting, it was to clarify a procedural detail. I explained a requirement, corrected a misunderstanding, and suggested a timeline adjustment. Everyone nodded. Someone thanked me. Then the conversation resumed as if I hadn't been there. And in that moment, I felt something shift internally. Not resentment, not hurt, but distance. The kind of distance that comes when you stop expecting to be seen and start observing clearly. I realized that my presence served a function, not a perspective. This wasn't about favoritism in the obvious sense. No one was openly preferred over me. It was subtler than that. Others were seen as decision makers, even when their ideas were impractical or incomplete. I was seen as a support system, even when my input was essential. Support systems aren't consulted, they're activated. Once I had that language in my head, I saw it everywhere, in how plans were looped me in after they were formed, in how my objections, when they surfaced, were reframed as logistical issues instead of valued disagreements, in how my agreement was assumed, but my disagreement felt inconvenient. I had been assigned the role of stability, and stability in family dynamics is often taken for granted because it doesn't complain. There was a strange relief in this clarity. It explained why speaking up felt so awkward before. Why did my questions cause brief discomfort? Why did the system always seem to reset back to the same configuration, no matter how much effort I put into adjusting it? I wasn't failing to be heard. I was succeeding at being predictable. That realization forced an uncomfortable question. Why had I allowed this role to persist? The answer wasn't flattering, but it was honest. Because it made me feel needed. Because it lets me avoid conflict. Because being useful felt safer than being visible. But usefulness has limits. It comes with expectations, not authority. Responsibility, not agency. As the conversation that day wrapped up, Tasks were casually distributed. My name appeared next to several of them. I nodded. I wrote them down. Outwardly, nothing changed. Inwardly, something had. For the first time, I stopped asking myself how to perform the role better. I started asking whether I wanted to keep performing it at all. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't announce a boundary. I didn't withdraw my help. I simply noted, with quiet precision, where I stood. And once you know your position in a system, you can decide whether to remain where you are or move. The day something shifted didn't involve my family at all. That's what makes it difficult to explain to people who expect turning points to be loud or public. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was alone, sitting at my desk, sorting through old files, some digital, some paper, not out of nostalgia, out of habit. I've always kept records, notes, timelines, copies of things that might matter later. It's not distrust, it's orientation. Some people remember feelings, I remember details. I came across a folder labeled with a year from nearly a decade earlier. Inside were documents related to a financial decision our family had made together, or so I had believed at the time. Agreements, email chains, and handwritten notes from conversations I'd assumed were informal. Reading through them slowly, something became obvious in a way it never had before. The version of events I carried in my head didn't match the record. Certain decisions I thought were shared had been finalized without my involvement. My later agreement had been a response to a conclusion already reached. My role hadn't been to decide, it had been to implement and absorb. Seeing it laid out chronologically stripped away the ambiguity I'd relied on for years. There was no dramatic betrayal, just a pattern, consistent and clear. I sat there longer than I needed to, not shocked, not angry, just still. What shifted in that moment wasn't my opinion of my family. It was my opinion of my responsibility. I realized I had been carrying emotional obligations that were never reciprocated. I had been loyal to a version of fairness that existed mostly in my own expectations. And more importantly, I realized something else. I was no longer obligated to preserve a system that depended on my silence to function. That thought didn't feel rebellious. It felt practical. I thought back to every time I told myself, this isn't the right moment. Every time I'd postponed discomfort for the sake of peace. I saw how often later had become a way of saying never. This time, there was no impulse to confront anyone, no urge to send emails or demand explanations. Confrontation would have kept me inside the same dynamic, reacting, justifying, waiting for validation. Instead, I felt a kind of internal detachment, not withdrawal, just clarity. I asked myself a simple question. What would change if I stopped assuming goodwill was enough? The answer wasn't emotional, it was structural. I realized that the only reason the current arrangement worked was that I continued to behave as expected. If I changed my behavior quietly, strategically, the system would have to respond, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. That was the moment silence stopped being passive. It became a choice. I closed the folder. I didn't delete anything. I didn't organize it further. I simply noted what I already had and what it meant. Information doesn't demand action immediately. It just waits. In the days that followed, nothing outward changed. I attended family calls. I responded politely. I fulfilled obligations. But internally, I had stepped out of the role I'd been assigned. I stopped assuming. I stopped filling in gaps automatically. I stopped volunteering explanations for decisions I hadn't made. And I noticed how quickly small pauses made others uneasy. How often silence prompted clarifications that had never been offered before. How the absence of my automatic compliance created tiny delays, enough to expose how much the system relied on it. That's when I understood something important. The power I had was never in confrontation. It was in withholding the labor that made everything feel effortless. The shift wasn't visible yet, but it was irreversible. Once you stop performing a role unconsciously, you can never fully return to it. Even if you choose to help again, it's on your terms. That afternoon didn't change my family, it changed my alignment. And from that point on, every decision I made was informed by one quiet truth. Clarity, once gained, doesn't fade. It only waits to be acted on. Once I stopped reacting automatically, silence took on a different shape. It was no longer something I defaulted to out of habit or politeness. It became deliberate, measured. And because the change was internal, no one noticed it at first. Family conversations continued, much as they always had. Plans were discussed, assumptions were made. My name still appeared in places it always had. The difference was that I no longer rushed to fill in the gaps. I didn't correct misunderstandings immediately. I didn't smooth over awkward pauses. I let them sit. At first, this was interpreted as a distraction. Someone would say, "Harper, did you hear that?" And I'd answer calmly, "Yes." Nothing more. No reassurance, no elaboration. That small restraint created discomfort. People are accustomed to systems that respond predictably. When a familiar response disappears, they don't assume intention, they assume weakness, or confusion, or fatigue. I heard it in the tone of their voices. "You okay? You seem quiet lately." As if quietness had only now been noticed because it wasn't performing its usual function. I assured them I was fine, which was true. What I didn't do was volunteer help prematurely. When someone mentioned an upcoming task, I didn't immediately claim it. When a decision was floated, I didn't immediately validate it. I waited to be asked. Often the question never came, and that was revealing. Without my automatic participation, conversations became less efficient. Decisions took longer. Details were missed. Minor issues surfaced that I would have previously resolved quietly in the background. No one accused me of withholding. There was nothing overt to point to. I hadn't refused anything. I had simply stopped anticipating. Still, the narrative adjusted itself. I could feel it happening. "Oh, Harper's been busy. Maybe Harper's overwhelmed. We can figure it out without bothering Harper." That last one stayed with me, not because it offended me, but because it was untrue. They couldn't figure it out. Not fully. But acknowledging that would have required admitting how much they relied on me without realizing it. So instead, my silence was reframed as absence. My restraint is disengagement. And that framing allowed everyone else to maintain the belief that nothing essential was changing. From the outside, I looked exactly the same: calm, agreeable, still present. On the inside, I was observing how quickly a system adapts when it senses a shift in power, even a subtle one. What surprised me most was how little pushback there was. No confrontation, no demands, just quiet adjustments around me. as if everyone was testing whether my role could be redistributed without discussion. It couldn't. Things slipped, deadlines blurred, assumptions collided with reality. And when problems surfaced, there was a noticeable hesitation before my name was mentioned, as if invoking me now required justification. That hesitation was new. Silence, when chosen, creates space, and space forces others to reveal what they've been taking for granted. I still helped when asked directly. I didn't disappear. I simply required clarity. Requests had to be spoken aloud. Decisions had to be explained. Some people interpreted this as me being less generous, less flexible, less easy. They weren't wrong, but they misunderstood the reason. This wasn't withdrawal, it was alignment. I was no longer willing to carry responsibilities that came without agency. And because I wasn't announcing this change, others were left to interpret it however they needed to. Most chose the explanation that required the least self reflection. They assumed I was stepping back because I couldn't handle more. The truth was the opposite. I had never been more capable, more clear, more grounded in what I was willing and not willing to give. Silence had always been my default. Now it was my leverage. And leverage doesn't announce itself, it waits. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while everyone else assumed nothing had changed. Because silence doesn't mean inactivity, it just means the work is happening somewhere they're not looking. While family conversations continued at the surface level, updates, complaints, minor coordination issues, I began paying attention to structure, not emotions, not intentions. Structure tells the truth when people don't realize they're speaking. I started by organizing what I already had: years of emails, financial summaries, notes from conversations that had felt informal at the time. I wasn't searching for wrongdoing, I was mapping patterns. Who initiated the decisions? Who benefited? Who bore responsibility when something went wrong? Once you lay it all out, you don't need accusations. The imbalance speaks for itself. I noticed how often my name appeared as a solution rather than a participant. How frequently my labor bridged gaps that were never acknowledged. How rarely my perspective altered outcomes unless it was framed as logistics. And then I did something I'd never done before. I stopped assuming shared understanding. I began verifying everything quietly: policies, ownership structures, legal defaults, financial implications that had been glossed over in conversation because they were family matters. That phrase, family matters, turns out to be one of the most expensive assumptions you can make. I learned what documents actually carried weight and which ones were symbolic. I learned how informal agreements dissolve the moment pressure is applied. I learned how easily we all agreed becomes, "That's not what I remember." And I learned that clarity favors the prepared. None of this required secrecy in the dramatic sense. I wasn't hiding. I simply wasn't narrating my process. I asked neutral questions in neutral settings. I requested copies of things under reasonable pretexts. I reviewed information that had always been technically accessible but never examined closely. People tend not to notice preparation when it looks like competence. What they did notice, or thought they noticed, was that I was less reactive, less eager to fix things. That made them comfortable. They assumed disengagement where there was actually focus. I also began documenting in real time, not emotionally, precisely: dates, decisions, who was present, what was said versus what was later claimed. I didn't editorialize. I didn't interpret. I just recorded. This wasn't about building a case against anyone. It was about building a clear internal narrative that couldn't be rewritten by collective memory later. Family systems rely heavily on shared stories. The problem is that shared stories tend to favor whoever speaks the loudest or earliest. I wasn't interested in competing there. I was positioning myself somewhere quieter and far more stable: reality. As I did this, something unexpected happened. My emotional charge around the situation faded, not because things had improved, but because confusion had been replaced by understanding. Once you see the mechanics, you stop personalizing the outcome. I realized that what I had experienced wasn't unique to my family. It was a common dynamic intensified by money. The person who smooths things over becomes the person whose needs are postponed indefinitely. The person who keeps things running becomes invisible precisely because things are running. That insight removed the last trace of anger I might have felt. Anger clouds judgment. I needed clarity. I also began thinking long term for the first time, not in terms of inheritance amounts or fairness debates, but in terms of exposure. What risks was I quietly absorbing? What liabilities had been normalized under the guise of helping out? What assumptions would become dangerous if circumstances changed? These weren't hypothetical questions anymore. They were practical ones. And slowly, without telling anyone, I adjusted my position. I declined vague responsibilities that came without definition. I asked for specifics in writing. I separated my personal finances cleanly from anything shared. I made sure that if my name appeared anywhere, it was intentional and limited. From the outside, this looked like maturity, responsibility, maybe even distance. From the inside, it felt like finally standing on solid ground. The irony is that everyone assumed this phase would pass, that I'd eventually return to being the automatic solution. They didn't notice that I was no longer orienting myself around their expectations at all. By the time they sensed something was different, the groundwork had already been laid, quietly, carefully, and irreversibly. The reveal didn't arrive like a twist in a movie. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of triumph. It came slowly, through confirmation rather than surprise. I was reviewing documents late one evening. Nothing urgent, just following a thread I'd noticed earlier. A discrepancy, small enough to dismiss if you weren't looking for it, significant enough to matter if you were. I cross-checked it against another record, then another. What emerged wasn't a secret in the dramatic sense. It was a structural advantage, something that had gone unnoticed because everyone assumed the arrangement was settled, permanent, unquestionable. It wasn't. The leverage wasn't about money alone. It was about position, about how certain responsibilities had been delegated informally while authority remained undefined, about how some decisions relied on my continued participation to remain valid in practice, even if they appeared complete on paper. In simple terms, the system worked because I made it work. And without my cooperation, it would require renegotiation, legally, financially, and emotionally. I sat with that realization for a long time, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be certain that I wasn't interpreting it through emotion. I revisited everything from different angles. I imagined counterarguments. I tested the assumptions. Each time, the conclusion held. This wasn't a loophole. It wasn't manipulation. It was the natural result of years of informal dependence layered over formal structures that had never been updated, and no one else had noticed because no one else had needed to. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt responsibility. Leverage is dangerous when paired with resentment. I was careful not to let it become that. I reminded myself that this wasn't about punishment or correction. It was about alignment, bringing reality back into a system that had drifted too far on convenience. What struck me most was how fragile everything suddenly seemed. Not emotionally, structurally. So much of what my family assumed was stable relied on continued patterns of behavior rather than explicit agreement. Once you see that, you can't unsee it. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found, not because I was hiding it, but because announcing leverage changes its nature. It turns clarity into a threat. I wasn't interested in threats. Instead, I asked myself a harder question. What outcome do I actually want? The answer surprised me. I didn't want recognition. I didn't want apologies. I didn't even want fairness in the abstract sense. What I wanted was a clean separation between obligation and choice. I wanted any involvement going forward to be explicit, consensual, and bounded. That meant something had to change. But change didn't require confrontation. It required restructuring. I began preparing for that quietly. I consulted professionals, not to escalate, but to understand implications. I asked hypotheticals. I learned what actions would trigger review, what timelines mattered, what could be revised unilaterally, and what required consensus. Knowledge at this stage was not power. It was a restraint. Every step I considered was weighed against one principle. Would this create clarity or just drama? If the answer leaned toward drama, I discarded it. I also acknowledged something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. If I did nothing, the outcome would still be a choice, one that left me exposed, one that preserved everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own agency. Doing nothing had always been framed as neutrality. Now I saw it for what it was: participation without consent. The private reveal wasn't that I held leverage. It was that I no longer needed to explain myself to use it responsibly. I closed my notes that night with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. Not relief, not anticipation, just steadiness. Because the moment you stop hoping people will treat you differently and start preparing for them to treat you the same, you regain control over your future. I hadn't made a move yet, but I knew exactly where I stood, and that knowledge changed everything. Once you see all your options clearly, indecision becomes its own decision. I reached a point where doing nothing felt dishonest to myself more than anyone else. Not because I was obligated to act, but because I now understood the cost of inaction. The longer I stayed silent in the old way, the more I would be reinforcing a structure that benefited from my restraint without respecting it. I laid out the options carefully. The first was the most familiar. Stay quiet, stay useful, stay predictable. Let things continue as they had, absorbing responsibility while telling myself it wasn't worth the disruption to change. That path required no explanation, no discomfort in the short term. It also required that I accept a future where my role would never shift, only deepen. The second option was confrontation, a conversation, or several. I could explain how I felt, outline the patterns I'd noticed, and ask for acknowledgement. On the surface, it seemed reasonable, healthy, even. But I knew this family. I knew how those conversations went. They would focus on tone instead of substance, on intentions instead of outcomes, on how no one meant for you to feel that way. And then, eventually, things would return to baseline, just with a layer of awkwardness added. Confrontation would cost me energy without guaranteeing change. The third option was structural adjustment. Quiet, formal, precise. Change the framework so that expectations could no longer operate on assumptions alone. Remove ambiguity. Separate roles. Redefine participation. This option didn't require anyone to agree with me. It didn't require understanding or validation. It required only that reality be acknowledged where it already existed. That was the option I kept coming back to. What made it irreversible wasn't the action itself, it was the mindset required to take it. Once you choose clarity over comfort, you can't go back to pretending the old system was fair. You can't unlearn what you've learned. I spent weeks sitting with that choice, not procrastinating, preparing, making sure my reasoning wasn't reactive, making sure I could live with the consequences, including the emotional ones. Because there would be consequences. People don't react well when invisible labor stops being invisible. When boundaries appear where there were none before, they feel like loss, even if nothing was taken from them. I accepted that I might be misunderstood, that my actions could be framed as cold or selfish, that I would no longer be the easiest person in the room. That acceptance was the final test. One evening, after another casual family call that ended with vague expectations and unspoken assumptions, I closed my laptop and felt something settle. I was done waiting for permission. The choice I made wasn't dramatic. It didn't feel like a break. It felt like alignment catching up to reality. I initiated the process the next morning, calmly, methodically, no announcements, no ultimatums. Just a shift in how things were structured from that point forward. I didn't frame it as a reaction to past behavior. I framed it as a necessary update, a modernization, something that made sense given current circumstances. Which was true. Once the decision was made, there was no anxiety, no second guessing, just execution. That's how you know you've chosen the right path. Not when it feels exciting, but when it feels inevitable. There was no turning back now. Not because of what I was about to do, but because of who I had become in the process of choosing it. The most noticeable thing about that phase was how unnoticeable it was. From the outside, nothing looked different. I still answered messages. I still attended calls. I still spoke in the same measured tone. If anyone had been watching closely, which they weren't, they might have said I seemed a little more distant, a little more formal. But distance and formality are easy to misinterpret as busyness, or maturity, or nothing at all. Behind that calm exterior, I was making changes that didn't announce themselves. The first step was separation. Clean, deliberate, unemotional. I disentangled myself from any arrangement that relied on implied responsibility rather than explicit agreement. Wherever my name appeared as a default, I replaced it with a question mark or removed it entirely. I didn't explain why. I didn't need to. When asked for clarification, I responded with precision. I'm happy to help once the scope is clear. Can you put that in writing? I need to understand where responsibility begins and ends. These were not refusals, they were filters. Most requests dissolved under that level of clarity. Not because they were unreasonable, but because they had never been fully formed to begin with. They had relied on my willingness to fill in the blanks. I stopped doing that. At the same time, I formalized everything that made sense for me to handle. Boundaries weren't walls, they were definitions. If I were involved, it was intentional. If I wasn't, it was visible. That visibility was new. In parallel, I adjusted my financial posture quietly, not in a way that affected anyone else immediately, but in a way that ensured my future was no longer tethered to assumptions about shared outcomes. I reduced exposure. I closed loops that had been left open just in case. I made sure that if something changed suddenly, health, circumstances, priorities, I would not be the one scrambling to adapt. All of this was done without urgency. Urgency invites attention. Calm signals confidence. No one challenged these shifts directly. They were too subtle, too reasonable. If someone noticed, they didn't comment. If they felt something slipping out of reach, they didn't yet know what it was. That's the strange thing about structural change. You don't feel it until you need the structure you assumed would be there. During this time, family conversations continued as usual. Future plans were discussed in abstract terms. People spoke confidently about outcomes that no longer had the same foundation. I listened. I didn't correct them. Correcting them would have restored the old dynamic. Me as the stabilizer, the quiet guarantor of feasibility. I wasn't willing to play that role anymore. Instead, I let reality approach at its own pace. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when someone said, "We'll figure it out later." And I realized that later would arrive without the safety net they believed existed. That wasn't cruelty, it was a consequence. Moving in silence isn't about secrecy. It's about letting your actions speak only when they have to. It's about resisting the urge to explain yourself to people who haven't asked for clarity until it inconveniences them. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I wasn't setting a trap. I was simply no longer compensating for a system that refused to acknowledge my agency. By the time anyone sensed that something fundamental had shifted, the groundwork was already complete. The options they assumed were still open were no longer available. Not because I had taken something away, but because they had never secured it to begin with. Silence had done its work, and the consequences were already in motion. The consequences didn't arrive in a single moment. They unfolded gradually, in the way structural problems always do. First as inconvenience, then as confusion, and finally as concern. It started with small things. A task that should have been simple stalled longer than expected. Someone waited for a follow-up that never came. A decision that had always moved forward quietly suddenly required effort. Not a crisis, just friction. At first, the assumption was timing. Harper must be busy. Then logistics. Maybe something slipped through. No one jumped to the idea that the system itself had changed. Because systems feel permanent until they fail. I noticed the shift in tone before anyone acknowledged it outright. Messages became more tentative. Questions were framed less as statements and more as actual requests. Would you be able to? Replaced, you can just. That language mattered. It meant they were beginning to feel the absence of something they'd never named. There was a particular moment when it became obvious. A family issue arose. Nothing dramatic, but time sensitive. In the past, it would have quietly landed in my lap. This time, it floated in the group conversation unresolved. People talked around it, offered partial solutions, circled back to it days later with growing frustration. Finally, someone said, "We should probably ask Harper." Not, "Harper will handle it." Ask. I agreed to help, but only after clarifying scope, responsibility, and timeline. The process took longer, not because I was dragging my feet, but because this time, things were being defined instead of assumed. The delay unsettled them. I could see it in the way conversations shifted. There was a subtle unease, as if everyone sensed that the old shortcuts were gone, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. What they felt as loss wasn't actually something I'd taken away. It was the disappearance of effortless certainty, the comfort of knowing someone else would absorb complexity without complaint. That comfort is addictive. Without it, people had to confront details they'd never paid attention to before: financial implications, legal nuances, time commitments, the things I'd been quietly managing for years. And because they didn't see the full picture, they didn't understand why everything suddenly felt heavier. There were murmurs of frustration, not directed at me, not yet, but at the situation. Why is this so complicated all of a sudden? This used to be easier. Oh, I listened without responding. Explaining myself would have turned the focus back to my feelings. I didn't want that. I wanted the focus to stay where it belonged, on the structure that had relied on my silence. Eventually, someone did ask, carefully, "Is everything okay? You just seem less involved." I answered honestly, but minimally. "I'm involved where it makes sense. I just need things to be clearer now." That was all. Clarity, to people who benefit from ambiguity, can sound like withdrawal. From that point on, the consequences accelerated. Plans had to be revisited, assumptions corrected, timelines extended. People who had once spoken confidently about outcomes now hesitated, unsure of what they could count on. And slowly, the discomfort shifted from abstract frustration to something more personal. They began to realize that the version of the future they'd been picturing depended on a version of me that no longer existed. Not because I'd changed suddenly, but because I'd stopped compensating. There was still no confrontation, no accusations, just a growing awareness that something essential had moved out of reach, and no one could quite say when or how it had happened. That's the thing about quiet dominance. When it's done properly, people don't feel attacked. They just feel unprepared. By the time panic appeared, it was already too late to address its cause. It didn't look like panic at first. It looked like urgency dressed up as collaboration. Suddenly, there were more messages, more check-ins, more suggestions that we get everyone on the same page. Meetings were proposed, documents resurfaced, old conversations were referenced as if they could be reinterpreted into relevance again. What I noticed immediately was the change in tone. Where there had once been confidence, there was now carefulness. Where there had once been assumptions, there were now questions, asked a little too late, with just enough anxiety beneath them to be noticeable. People were trying to re-establish the old flow without acknowledging that it depended on conditions that no longer existed. Someone said, "We just need to get back to how we were doing things before." That sentence revealed everything. Before had only worked because I had been quietly absorbing uncertainty, because I had been willing to carry responsibility without authority, because I had filled in gaps without asking why they were there. You can't recreate that retroactively once it's been withdrawn. There were attempts at reassurance. We've always trusted you. We value what you do. These statements might have meant something earlier. Now, they sounded like negotiations offered after the terms had already changed. Trust, when invoked only after leverage shifts, feels less like appreciation and more like strategy. I didn't argue. I didn't contradict. I simply held my position. I'm happy to move forward, I said more than once, as long as expectations are clear and roles are defined. That condition became a barrier no one knew how to cross. Because clarity required revisiting decisions that had been taken for granted. It required admitting that some arrangements had never been fair or explicit. And that admission carried implications no one wanted to face. Regret began to surface, not expressed openly, but hinted at. Maybe we should have talked about this earlier. I didn't realize how much you were handling. Those statements hovered in the air, unfinished. They weren't apologies, they were acknowledgments of inconvenience. And inconvenience, when it reaches a certain scale, starts to feel like a loss. There was a particular meeting, longer than usual, tense without being confrontational, where it became clear that the system could not be repaired with good intentions alone. The options being discussed all required adjustments that people weren't prepared to make. Time had passed, conditions had changed. Some decisions were now locked in legally or financially. Reversing them would mean costs no one wanted to absorb. That's when the confusion set in. How did we not see this coming? When did this get so complicated? Why didn't anyone say something sooner? Those questions floated around the table, unanswered. I could have answered them. I had answers for all of them. But answering would have shifted responsibility back onto me. You should have spoken up. And that was a responsibility I was no longer willing to carry alone. Instead, I said nothing. Silence, at this stage, wasn't avoidance. It was an acknowledgement of reality. The moment for easy correction had passed. What remained were consequences that belonged to everyone, not just me. I watched people grapple with the realization that goodwill doesn't substitute for structure, that familiarity doesn't guarantee fairness, that relying on someone's patience is not the same as earning their consent. There was no explosion, no dramatic fallout, just a slow, sinking understanding that something fundamental had changed and could not be undone. Not because I refused to fix it, but because it had never truly been fixed to begin with. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was almost disappointingly quiet. There was no raised voice, no accusations, no rehearsed speeches delivered across a table. Just a moment when avoidance was no longer sustainable, and someone finally said what everyone else had been circling. We need to talk about what's changed. We sat together, physically close, emotionally distant. The air wasn't hostile, it was careful, like people stepping around something fragile. They weren't sure how to name it. I listened more than I spoke. They explained their confusion first, how things felt harder, how outcomes that once seemed certain were now unclear, how they didn't understand why I had pulled back. That phrase came up more than once. Pulled back. It implied retreat, disengagement, something temporary and emotional. I let them finish. Then I said calmly, I haven't pulled back. I've just stopped assuming responsibility for things I didn't agree to. That sentence landed heavier than anything louder could have. There was a pause, not defensive, processing. Someone responded with reassurance. We never meant for you to feel taken for granted. I know, I said. And I meant it. That's what made this conversation different. I wasn't trying to convince anyone of harm. I wasn't asking for validation of my feelings. I was stating facts. I explained briefly what had changed, not chronologically, not emotionally, but structurally. I described how many decisions had relied on implied consent, how my involvement had been assumed rather than defined, how that worked smoothly until it didn't. No blame, no history lessons, just cause and effect. They asked why I hadn't said something sooner. I answered honestly, because it always felt like it wasn't the right moment. And eventually, that becomes the system. No one argued with that. There was an attempt to soften the implications. Can't we just figure out a way to make this work again? I shook my head gently. We can make something work, but it won't be the same thing. That was the line that closed the door. Not slammed, just shut. I could see it then. The realization that the version of me they'd relied on wasn't coming back. Not because I was angry, but because I was no longer willing to operate without clarity. They asked what I wanted. I told them the truth. Defined roles, clear agreements, and the freedom to say no without it being treated as a problem. Those were reasonable requests. They also required effort, adjustment, a redistribution of responsibility. No one promised anything in that moment. There were nods, quiet acknowledgments, a sense that something had been settled without being resolved. And that was enough. I didn't leave feeling victorious. I didn't leave feeling wounded. I left feeling finished. The confrontation hadn't been about winning an argument. It had been about making my position visible in a way that couldn't be ignored or mischaracterized later. There was no emotional release, no catharsis, just clarity, finally spoken out loud. And sometimes that's the most decisive thing you can do. After everything settled, not resolved, not healed in the way people like to imagine, but settled, I noticed something unexpected. I felt lighter, not because the outcome favored me, not because everything was suddenly fair or balanced, but because I was no longer carrying an identity that required constant maintenance. For most of my life, I had been the reliable one, the steady presence, the person others leaned on without thinking about the weight involved. Letting go of that role felt strange at first. Like stepping out of a uniform I'd worn for so long, I forgot it wasn't my skin. But once it was off, I could finally feel where I actually stood. Who I am now isn't defined by distance or detachment. I didn't become colder. I became clearer. I still care about my family. I still show up. I still help when it's chosen, not assumed. The difference is that my help now has edges. I'm no longer available by default. I'm available by agreement. That shift changed how I see myself in every part of my life. At work, in friendships, in quiet decisions no one else sees. I stopped mistaking endurance for virtue. I stopped equating harmony with silence. And I stopped believing that being needed was the same as being respected. There's no bitterness in me when I look back. Bitterness requires the belief that something was stolen. I don't believe that. What happened was simpler and more human than that. A system optimized itself around my compliance. When that compliance ended, the system had to adjust. That's not betrayal. That's physics. I don't resent my family for not noticing sooner. People rarely question what works for them. I also don't blame my past self for staying quiet. Silence once protected me. It kept me connected. It helped me survive a dynamic I didn't yet understand, but it no longer defines me. Now, when I'm quiet, it's because I'm choosing to listen, not because I'm waiting to absorb someone else's expectations. When I speak, it's because there's something meaningful to add, not because I'm trying to prevent discomfort. I've learned that clarity can feel like distance to people who benefited from your ambiguity. And I've learned to be okay with that. Some relationships adjusted, some didn't. A few became more honest, others grew polite, careful, slightly removed. I let that happen without forcing closeness or explanation. Not every connection is meant to survive redefinition. What I carry forward isn't a lesson about money alone, though money was the catalyst. It's a lesson about visibility, about how easily kindness can be mistaken for availability, about how loyalty, when unexamined, can turn into quiet self erasure. I'm not louder now, I'm not harder, I'm just no longer invisible. And that, it turns out, changes everything. If there's one thing this story taught me, it's that money doesn't create conflict in families. It accelerates what's already there. It sharpens existing roles. It rewards old patterns. And it exposes the quiet agreements no one ever thought to question. Inheritance didn't turn us into enemies overnight. It didn't fracture us with greed or dramatic betrayal. What it did was reveal how loyalty had been unevenly distributed long before numbers were involved. How some people were protected by assumption, while others were protected only by their willingness to endure. For a long time, I believed loyalty meant staying quiet, being flexible, making things easier for everyone else. I thought restraint was maturity and accommodation was love. What I learned instead is that loyalty without agency eventually becomes self erasure. No one wakes up intending to take advantage of the dependable person. It happens gradually, through comfort, through familiarity, through the quiet belief that someone will always be there to absorb the impact, until one day they aren't. And when that happens, it feels like loss, even though nothing was taken. What changed my life wasn't confrontation or vindication, it was clarity. The moment I understood that I was allowed to redefine my role without asking permission, that I didn't need to justify boundaries to people who had benefited from their absence. Money didn't corrupt my family. It simply removed the illusion that love alone could substitute for fairness. And here's the part people rarely talk about. Choosing clarity comes with a cost. You may be misunderstood. You may no longer be the easiest person to deal with. Some relationships may never return to the warmth they once had. But what you gain in return is alignment. You gain the ability to say yes without resentment and no without guilt. You gain relationships that are based on choice instead of obligation. And you gain something even quieter, but far more powerful: a sense of self that doesn't depend on being needed to feel worthy. If you're listening to this and seeing yourself somewhere in my story, I want you to know this. Being reliable is not a flaw. Being kind is not a weakness. Silence, when chosen, can be a strength, but none of those should cost you visibility. Families, like all systems, respond to what we tolerate. When you change what you tolerate, the system has no choice but to respond, whether it's ready or not. This isn't a story about winning or losing. It's about stepping out of a role that no longer fits, even when others are more comfortable with you staying exactly where you were. So I'll leave you with this question. One I wish I had asked myself much earlier. Have you ever been so dependable that people forgot to ask what it was costing you? If you have, I'd like to hear your story.